Whether we are making sense by thinking that every creed and race in any community may find an equal place, I think that's really something that we continuously strive for, as do other people in other countries. Race is a difficult issue, but to be honest with you, perhaps I should share my experience of race to break away from the generalizations about it. As far as I know, I am of East Indian descent from a rural community. When I went to study in the United Kingdom, I found that I had very little in common with the Asians who were studying at the college I attended, because I didn't speak the language and I looked different. And when I traveled around Europe with other students at the end of my course of study, I found that the people I met also couldn't figure out who I was or where I was from. The only place that I felt that I truly belonged was this place and this space. So I think that there is the perception that people of different communities do not have a sense of belonging. And I don't know that that perception holds true in the sense that it may have done right after independence. We seem to be speaking in a language sometimes which belongs in those times, post-independence days, when people were, fractured by this and that and the other. But I think we have to recognize that time has passed, over 50 years have passed, and that the generations who have been born since independence perhaps do not view things in the same way. They do not respond to the rhetoric of race in the way that their previous generations used to. And I think if we stop generalizing about divisions such as these and start to remember that people are people and they will respond to different stimuli, we may be able to reach more people and have a more productive discussion about how we can use the institutions in this place and in this space for the greater good. Now, I'm pretty sure Mariano doesn't disagree with me because he has a political background. But I don't pretend to be an expert in politics, so I suspect that if he disagrees with me, he will tell me so.
Thank you, Colin, and hello, everybody. And thank you for the recognition as the incoming MAT president, and just to protect the organization from whatever I might say. I'm not here in that capacity, and I don't speak on behalf of the organization, just for the protection of that little institution that we try to sort of to nurture. Right, so when I received the correspondence about this, I have to tell you I was deeply confused. And I was deeply confused up to, well, I'm still deeply confused. So I started eventually to start thinking about why I was deeply confused. And I think it's, just to sort of bring the conversation back to journalism a little bit, I think maybe that is the area that sort of confused me a little bit. Because we have an environment in which, as commentators, as columnists, public speakers, and people who, I suppose people refer to us as sort of opinion shapers, and I don't think that we are really, I think we have an opinion per person in Trinidad. I think that is part of our complex, and I think that is a good and a positive thing. So let me just sort of start by saying that journalists who function additionally as commentators differ from commentators who are non-journalists. And I want to make that distinction early because some of the exposure that journalism brings, I think, guides journalist commentators in a way that it does not guide non-journalist commentators. Just the extent to which we tap into, on a daily basis and face-to-face, the overt and obscure sociologies of Trinidad and Tobago. And in that regard, I can launch a spirited defense of all of the stories we've run on the buck, because I can relate it to Sipasad Naipaul, and writing for The Guardian Weekly in the late 40s and during the 1950s. And there was a piece that he wrote in particular, headlined, "Mourners Visit China in the Spirit World." And it was a piece about Baptists on the mourning ground. The idea of spiritism is very much part of our identity and our reality in the region and in Trinidad. And it is an aspect of our identity that journalism understands and therefore is able to interact with in a way that some other superior thinkers feel that we ought not to have interacted with it. And just to sort of cross-reference that a bit with Mariano's comments, in particular about Juve and about Carnival and what he refers to as our enjoyment. And I mean, I love Mariano, but it reminds me, the comment reminded me of why in the early days economics was referred to as the dismal science. And it tells me why, it helps to explain, I think, why sometimes leadership is unable to sort of tap into the sort of sensibilities and the cultural sensibilities of the society, and often seems to be guiding the society in ways that are sometimes contrary and sometimes contentious with the direction in which the society itself is sort of angling towards and sort of wanting to go. So that understanding of the society, of those sociologies, is a particular sort of benefit that comes from being a journalist in Trinidad and Tobago and being a journalist over a long period of time and accessing people and accessing communities in ways that many other people, and it's a privilege, in ways that many people are unable to do. And therefore, what we produce is we produce out of a basic principle that we are here to offer comfort to the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. So my comment about Mariano, therefore, is just to do some affliction of the comfortable. Thank you, Colin.
Well, with that provocation, are there others?
Well, I don't know if I got it twice, on the left and the right. So let me put it this way, and let me perhaps recast the development problem, because the development problem does not consider, ought not to consider race. It is really about how do we improve citizens in a way that allows a society to function and to grow. Growth does not necessarily mean income, but it could include that as well. In fact, it probably does. And one of the critical issues of doing that is actually to remove the concept of race and treat each person as an individual. Our economics and perhaps the conversation about economics in Trinidad and Tobago is really about how much money has been spent and per capita income, and less about quality of life. the other types of indicators that you would find in terms of healthcare, in terms of participation in the society. And we need to spend more time on that. But the fundamental issue about development economics, which is not really spoken about, and which perhaps we deal with every day, is about the strength, depth, and capacity of our institutions, and the sense of faith or trust that we have that those institutions will function in a way that we could depend on, that reflects what we need. And I think that's one of our biggest issues, that our development has not spent enough time in terms of developing our institutions. And the institutions is a combination, and the institution has no memory. When we get up and leave here, these chairs are not going to speak about what we did as a whole. It really is what we carry in our minds, in our heads. So that has a lot to do with our trust and our understanding. But at the same time, administering a society is also about the strength of our institutions. And if you look around as we speak, we have difficulties understanding or putting faith or trust in any of our institutions. That's a fundamental issue. And that perhaps is one of the issues that deals with the sense of belonging, the sense of trust, and also to how our education system functions. And we have some very serious issues at the moment. I mean, what is crime? What does crime reflect? A failure of certain types of institutions and in a sense, not a sense of belonging to growing the society and or personal growth, personal responsibility for it moving forward. So how do we repair some of those institutions? Because that's where equality comes from. At the end of the day, it is about the development of individuals, because individuals come to take up certain types of positions in society, and also they are also responsible for running those institutions. When you go to a public office, you're not interfacing with a machine, you're interfacing with people. And the responses of those people vary widely. And part of that has to do with the fact that the institutions and structures are not sufficiently robust from a systemic point of view. So that if you go to one department and they tell you something, and you come back 2 days later, make certain you go back to that same person. Because if you meet somebody else, they'll probably tell you a different system altogether. Right? And that's the reality. So that those are the types of things, I think, have a lot to do. And I agree with your point that the racial responses would be different today than from 50 years ago. I think we've matured a lot more. There's a lot less distrust. But that doesn't mean to say that there is trust. It means that there's less distrust. And I think that's where we are. So from my perspective, from the economic point of view, I would say that we spent more time talking about how much money that we have spent rather than talking about how strong our institutions are. And our conversations daily amongst ourselves is about how difficult it is to get certain things done. That's our shared experience. That is difficult. What is the transportation system? Is there a transportation system? How do we fix it? What does it require? Does it require a monorail? Does it require a rapid rail? Or really does it require 700 buses instead of 200 that probably work? Those are the sorts of things I believe that also have a lot more to do with the concept of equality and our interactions with one another, as well as the quality of life that we have. I'm talking about the fundamental issue that development and economic development has not spent enough time talking about the strength of our institutions, and quite frankly, we undervalue the importance and the existence and the quality of those institutions and how they function on a daily basis.
Well, Sophia's asking whether our institutions serve each other equally. I want to jump in a little bit because I think you're being far too polite, even despite Sheila's provocation. When I wrote for The Guardian as a columnist, not as a journalist, 2 of my columns were censored. One where I wrote about abortion, and I referred to political leaders' stances. And another one that I titled Indians Own the Country. And the provocation there was an observation that there was a kind of aspirationalism in the UNC's coming to power that Africans in Trinidad and Tobago, I thought, lacked around this idea of country and state and participation. And I think this whole question of ownership and who feels a sense of inclusion and engagement with change and a sense of hopefulness around the country is not equally spread. And the institutions that we've inherited, to go back to Attillah's point, are ones that were created to exclude most people. They were not created for efficiency. They were created to legitimate systems of inequality and violence. And that's where the walls in Woodbrook come from.
So be specific.
Fundamentally.
Because I don't understand. I find that's far too general. I would like you to be more specific. Tell me what institutions.
I can give you an
I think
example.
the judiciary for one, but go ahead and
I
tell
can
us.
give you an example. The museum, the National Museum, which started off as the Victoria Institute, which was, it started in, I want to say 1869, but I don't think that that's the correct year. 1807. 1867, right? That institution was set up to study plants, tropical plants, and think, right? And say what kind of stone and what kind of bush it have here, because that's what the colonial authorities were interested in being able to tap into. They weren't interested in what kind of mass Igbo people were playing. They weren't interested in that, because as far as they were concerned, what those people were doing was savage. It was obscene. Those people, as far as they were concerned, had no culture anyway. Mm-hmm. So they created an institution that was designed to exclude us, the people who were working in the space, right? I think to this day, the institution that exists in the form of the National Museum has no space for mass. So when you talk about us throwing away our mass, it's not because we don't want to keep the mass. Where are we going to keep it? It have no museum for mass. Have no carnival museum. It don't even have one warehouse where people can make mass, which is the thing that we do a lot.
So now we have permission to interrupt each other. So I am actually going to ask Mariano and Sofia if they've ever sat in the Parliament Public Gallery, because a number of us have been sitting there fairly often, and that is the embodiment of how institutions are not intended to serve or include us. One we refer to as strangers when we visit these people whose salaries we pay. You can't write, you can't talk, which is reasonable. You can't cross your legs in the first row. You can't cross your legs in the first row. The uniformed officers who didn't prevent the coup will come and tell you can't cross your foot. I mean, these are the relics of institutional irrelevance that have remained and that, we often encounter at service counters across the nation where people are defending rules that have stopped making sense. And I often just stop and ask, why? That making sense to you? But I also think that we think authority is the solution to everything. We think everything is misbehavior, and the solution, what has gone wrong, is that we stop caning children, and if we impose more authority through institutions, through rules, through hierarchies, we'd go back to a space where things worked. So I want to leave you all with those provocations to kind of tell me I'm wrong. We're afraid of freedom.
I don't know if you were talking that, and were you directing that specifically to Sofia, because I wouldn't want to jump into the sentence.
No, I mean just in general. I mean, I talked to the two people who've been in Parliament about my experience of coming to visit them.
And the hemline too short and the whole shebang in the Parliament. But, I mean, that's what one aspect, an important aspect, one aspect of a sort of a general sort of space and a general sort of way in which we have constructed and our realities have been constructed for us. at the root of it, in my observation, and I will credit Suniti Maharaj with sort of some of this thinking, is that we have to confront, I feel, a rather uncomfortable reality, uncomfortable only because we are so many years past independence, that we have, as individuals and as a people, a dysfunctional relationship with power. We have a dysfunctional relationship with power. That the way in which power has been exercised has never been legitimate, that we have not respected, or we have not had experiences of power being legitimately exercised and exercised in the service of people of the country, as opposed to exercised in the service of the status quo and all of the elements of that. And that sort of manifests in every way, so that the tunicked officers at the parliament exercise power in a way that is oppressive. And every security guard, otherwise powerless, exercises power as a security guard in a certain way, and as journalists we understand that because we have to go through them all the time. Executive secretaries to CEOs and chairmen and whatnot exercise power in their little bubbles. They don't have it otherwise. They get it in these positions and sort of exercise it in that way. When people assume positions of authority, the first thing they want to do with those positions of authority and the power that comes with it is to fire somebody, send somebody home. In other words, our exercise of power is generally brutal and generally sort of antagonistic towards ourselves. And so at the root of all that you have described is, I think, that issue of how we relate to power and what our relationship with power is. And I think that is a dysfunctional relationship, and that is really at the core of many of the sort of interactions that we have been speaking about today, interactions among people, among communities, and primarily interactions between institutions and people that they are set up to.
Well, Sheila, if I may say, I think you have got to the root of it, which is to say it's individual insecurities that operate on our minds, because we see a lot of us seem to be thinking that we must wait for somebody to invite us into this community in which we live, instead of walking in and saying, this is my place. I own it. I belong here. And I encounter that in different aspects of life, especially in the courtroom, in the judicial system. You see these archaic procedures. You have a court system which is supposed to be open to all citizens. People who come there are not happy to be there. And generally speaking, until they face a magistrate who may be willing to hear what they have to say, it's an entirely hostile environment. But it is, I suppose, one of the more extreme examples of citizens waiting to be invited in. Because one of the things that I do when I have the opportunity to travel is, like a junkie, I go to every courthouse in every jurisdiction to see how they operate there and how I can compare it with what we have here. And it amazes me that in other countries I see people going to court in T-shirts and speaking up for themselves. They may not necessarily be educated people, but they have a sense of appreciation that the institution that they are entering is theirs, and they are entitled to hearing. And I think we do not have that there, and we should encourage that.
But I think it goes back. It goes back again to development, and who are we developing for, and what is the end goal, or what is the vision that is pushing us towards development, whatever that means. I feel like we are imagining scenarios for a world that no longer exists, and our education, the education that our children are receiving at this point, is preparing them for a world that no longer exists. And our institutions continue to be in this sort of fossilized state where they're just not relevant. They're not relevant to the people. They're not relevant to the environment. They're relevant to nothing and nobody. And I keep asking, what is the point? And who is it for? If it's not for us, who is it for?
But also, our identities matter profoundly. They aren't things, we aren't these, deraced, degendered people who this system and who institutions are responding to. We live in a place where those identities are amazing and people are deeply invested in them in some very productive but also some dysfunctional ways. And I think when we think about governance, we don't enter from that point of view that those things matter, that how an institution serves somebody can vary, immensely depending on who they are, on who they came from, on the meanings that they bring into that transaction, their sense of their place in the world, their sense of their people in the world, and that all those people are sharing the space. One of the things that an organization I work with, CAISO, did when evangelical preachers were protesting about in advance of the Jason Jones sodomy case verdict was we went out and confronted them playfully and said, keep calm and share the nation. And that vision of sharing the nation, I think, doesn't really drive or policy making. And I'm getting the signal that I should shut up and turn it over to the very eager people who are wanting to speak. How does this work? There's a mic that's going around. And so if you raise your hands, you can join the lively conversation. Let me recognize the two hands in this row here. We're going to take the interventions in small clusters and then respond.
It's on. Good morning to the panel and good morning to Attillah, especially. I hope after I say what I have to say, you still sign my book.
Of course.
I wanted to really gently challenge you when you said that you were Juvies and you did not feel that you were activists because you did not put your body on the line. And there's a reason why. The notion of activism and the notion of activism as putting your body in line is predicated on the body, very much so, and does not include persons with disabilities. And the fact is, we do a lot of activism, but for me, for example, putting myself to say that I put my body in line to go into jail means that my jail will be St. Anne's because I have mental health issues. And that in both civil society and in our wider policy-making society, we also do not recognize persons with alternative bodies. And when we do our policy-making, I know from policy-wise, we have an increasing aging population. We have a population that is beset by trauma and mental health issues because of crime, because of various things. And when we are doing our policy making and even our activism, we don't really think about that happen. And believe you me, everybody here is temporarily able-bodied. You don't know when, how, where, and when you may become disabled. So I wanted to challenge that because I remember even in feminist spaces last year or the year before, when they had the Women's March, I had to challenge them and say, here what? I'm not hearing anything for accommodations for persons with disabilities in terms of what you're going to do, what it is. And that has rendered many activist spaces people unable to do what it is. I present here as able-bodied right now, and I'm standing here, I'm looking pretty. But what people don't know behind the scenes is that even with a mental health issue, it costs me to be here. It costs me energy, it costs me time. And I've had to shape my activism in a way that allows me to have the energy and the ability to do it. So a lot of my activism is actually online and is in online spaces and is as a writer. And also judicial activism is also a big key space that persons with disabilities really move forward, at least in the States. We are a little behind here, but I'm hoping we get there. So I just wanted to challenge those notions.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Next to you. Oh, you didn't have your hand up.
You don't have to stand up, Yvonne, if you're...
Hello, everybody. I think like we are talking way up above on the sky, and we are not talking about Trini behavior. So I'm going to just give 3 little narratives that could actually spell whether we have an equal space or equal power. A couple of days ago, on my street, Saddle Road, a man opened a car wash place. I understand that he hired 2 Venezuelan women. One was whining on this side, and one was whining on that side. So the cars come in here, sat down and wait. The cars go into Maracas, waiting. I live next to an open space, and people came at Carnival and just throw garbage or whatever they did, but there was a lot of garbage there. Yvonne, what are you bothering your head about? What are you worried about? Activism is going out there, stop. A man comes with a vending truck under a sign which marks no vending. Yvonne, they're running to buy because, and I'm talking about people who are educated, well-dressed, as my grandmother would say, dress-factable. So they're running to buy because the oranges are $1 for each. When I looked at somebody, I said, I live here. She looked a little bit embarrassed, but that's... And the third story is that it took me 5 years to get my passport renewed. 5 years. During which time I saw 5 immigration officers, each telling me a different thing to do. When I tell my friends, oh God, but that's how it is, you know, you have to wait. I have been looking at our behaviors. Everybody is waiting to have power on the other person. I would be afraid to talk to any of you all because Mariano, I'm shaking. He might say, who's that? I am looking, that is the basic behavior of Trinidad. You go into somewhere, a security guard there to guard you, but they're buffing you. Don't go there, stay there. I think that these are the things that we should raise and see how they fit in to the highfalutin economic, I used to get low marks in economics, I hate it. And I love sociology because I'm looking at human behavior. So we say we don't like children. Let us find out how many people in our society don't like children. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There were some hands in the back. Okay, well, let's take a third intervention back there.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Benasia. I'm also the union representative representing daily paid workers at Swimpole. And these workers basically work on the dumps of Trinidad and Tobago. We do not have landfills. And if there's anybody here that is interested in protecting the environment, we need to force any government to start implementing international standards in waste management. Because the dumps we have here, they are poisoning They are poisoning our workers, the workers that I represent. And those of you that feel that you're safe, whether you live in Woodbrook or Westmoreland, you're not safe because the dust coming off of these dumps head westward with the air currents and swing north over by NP into Port of Spain for all who work in Port of Spain. And when the landfill fires strike, you know wherever the smoke is, that is where the dust is that you can't see any day. So when your children reach the age of 35 and 40, or they're playing in their backyards in Westmoreland, and I appeal to these people because the poor people in Laventille and Mova, although they might know that, do not have the connections to force these idiots to do what is right. For over 30 years, the management of Swimcall has been looking for funding to do these things. And now, while I might be a union representative, I am the president of a small internal union. So I work there. So I ain't talking like somebody looking from the outside. I know what is going on there. And we have our workers risking their health and lives, being paid basically minimum wage, but handling the waste of 1.4 million people and are treated like slaves. And we are saying that anybody believe in social justice must support the dump workers that we hope will be transformed into landfill, so we could call them landfill workers. And we have, in previous times, in my 19 going on 20 years there, we have had what I call the assassination of decent people, senior managers that wanted to do things right. And Mr. Browne alluded, he couldn't tell the difference between PNM and UNC, because I have seen bubble and corruption under the PNM, under the UNC, under the People's Partnership. The last partnership legally fired a CEO that was, his intention was to cut out all the illegal raping of taxpayers' money from that state enterprise. That's no.
I want to try and get the panel to respond because we want to get more people involved in the conversation.
Close off quickly.
Very, very quickly.
Very quickly. That attack on a decent man of integrity is taking place right now under the PNM with another CEO who has experience in implementing international standards. They want to frustrate him into resigning so that they can bring in somebody else to do it wrong again.
I think we got your point, and there's a lot of resonance I'm hearing for it. So responses from the panel.
Could I just start off very briefly? To the lady in red, I think sorry? Yvonne. If I may call you Yvonne, you could. I think we are on the same page, because what I am saying, what you're talking about is a sense of insecurity we have about dealing with the abuse of power, because we feel that somehow we don't have the right to step up and tell people that what you're doing is wrong. I think the examples you gave sort of reveal that kind of insecurity. The other thing is, I think we also have to remember that while generally people are cynical about institutions, institutions represent law and order in the country, and we need to have law and order to regulate our lives. If we were to get rid of all our institutions, we would have total chaos. We have to appreciate that there are different kinds of institutions. There are institutions, I think, which don't work, but which carry a lot of power in terms of bureaucracy. And we have to ensure that we haven't become so cynical that we just bypass them and we don't keep pulling up the individuals working within those institutions from serving the public. There are other institutions that people tend to underutilize, for example, the Equal Opportunities Commission. A lot of people who feel aggrieved, for example, by discrimination in the workplace for one reason or the other, whether they're differently abled and so on, you may go to the Equal Opportunities Commission and seek redress, but not many people do. So part of it is education about the institutions which exist. because we focus on the popular ones, you know, parliament, judiciary, and police. But we don't realize that there are other institutions which may improve our lot in life if we were to access them.
Well, I think access to those institutions, access to those things, levels of education, levels of awareness, the extent to which people, I mean, last October, after that awful flood, for example, when Trinidad was underwater, we had people telling people from St. Helena they had to come to Port of Spain to go to the Ministry of Social Development to do something, and just a sort of inability to reach people, and an inability to sort of understand that you leave your office and you get out and you go and do the work that is required in these communities when communities are under stress. So I think there's a whole complex, Sophia, about why people often do not access, so it's easy to say, step up and make demands, but the consequences of doing that sometimes are so severe on people. And quite often we are asking people who are least empowered to do the most empowered acts, right? And that is the sort of contradiction we do with domestic violence as well, where you ask women, well, why don't you just leave? If you're beating you, why don't you just leave, right? Not understanding that what is required for you to leave are the same things that are diminished by domestic violence. So that I think we need a sort of a more complicated understanding of the realities in which people live and all of the sort of walls that are put up around them that prevent them, one, from accessing, and two, that prevent them from standing up and saying that I tried to access and could not.
But could it also be that we are resisting, but not necessarily in the most productive ways? The forms of resistance we're engaging in have historically been about certain kinds of performance, of disobedience, that are not necessarily changing the system, that are not impacting institutions. But
we still have people who say, well, let me go and do the government work. So it's that kind of, again, the distance that people feel from something that they are making money from, but they don't feel a sense of ownership of it. Is the government work, the government road? Why the government don't do something about it? Why, and
which is why you'll get 5 different answers from different people, because there isn't a sense of a team, there isn't a sense of this is an institution that we're proud of. There's small places where you see it. In the Parliament, you see it. You see it at CPO. There are places I've noticed where it shines, but as a whole, there isn't a sense of, I have a sense of accountability to you. I'm here to serve you.
And Colin, just to kind of throw away line really in response really to Sophia about institutions. I mean, I understand because Sophia is a senior counsel. I mean, she's a lawyer, so that sort of perspective about law and order is sort of very important and sort of grounds, I think, her thinking. But there's another reality that we sort of have to also kind of start observing, that we are a wayward people. And in large measure, in so many ways, Trinidadians and Tobagonians, well, I would say perhaps specifically Trinidadians, are a self-governing people. And that is something very rich that nobody has been able to tap into, because
maybe we should be allowed to drive on the shoulder.
Antagonistic to this project of law and order.
So let's take some more questions. Were there any in this area? Any from the students? No? Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
No, I'm sorry to be late. Just 2 questions. First, I don't know if I need this. My voice is big. Sorry to be late. Just 2 questions. We've been talking about institutions. I don't know what an institution is, first to begin. But secondly, we've always been talking about the official culture. There's an unofficial culture where people where you were going have organized themselves from Jump Street.
Yes, that's right.
You go to L.A. de Verta's book of 1858, and it talks about Yoruba societies which organized themselves. The Ram Leelas being performed 11 days, people organizing themselves. Right. Why do we begin and start by privileging the official forms And the official institutions, why we talk about how we develop our own capacity in terms of self-organizational capacities that inhere in Ramleelas, in Hussein, in all of those carnival and so on. So I think if you start with the wrong premise, you end up with the wrong answer. It would be nice to talk about indigenous institutions.
Susu.
All of those, they're there. But I had a discussion, and everything I'm hearing is what the fella and the man and the parliament. Let's talk about people's organization and how do we use this as a basis for our own self-development.
Well said. Well said.
Any questions in the rear or interventions? No? I see a hand in the back that got overlooked before.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and esteemed panel. I just wanted to say that, in my opinion, I believe that our country suffers not just from an identity crisis, not understanding where we as individuals fitting as part of our country and a society as a whole, but from a mentality sort of block. We have a mentality crisis and an attitude that keeps us stagnated. That's all I wanted to say.
Other interventions?
I like to start to talk about our indigenous institutions. How we could draw upon that to make a better self-sufficient and self-organized society. The panelists deal with that.
I wanted to make a point as well about race, because we think that this idea of racial unity or whatever started with Shiv Shakti and Malik performers performing Ganges meets the Nile together, and somebody saying, yes, and Indians and Africans have to unite. That's folly. Because in 1884, we had a situation where the Crown wanted to outlaw the Hosei celebration, right? And a Hindu by the name of Sukhdeo was the person who petitioned the Crown for a Shia Muslim festival to go on the streets. When that permission was not granted, people walked from plantations all over Trinidad to go to Balidantola in South and to the other place, which I can't remember now, where Captain Baker, who was the same man who tried to stop the Cambule, he read the Riot Act to try and stop the Hosei. And I'm saying that to talk about the fact that culturally, as Professor Kadjo points out, culturally, people were always doing what they had to do to survive. If you go to Block 23, somewhere up in the back of Laventille, where I'm sure 90% of you will never go, there's a Orisha shrine where you will see a Shiva Murti, right? You can go to Orisha shrines all over. You can go to Kali Puja, where they will sing Christian songs, where they will sing Orisha songs, where they will sing Hindu songs. They will sing all kind of songs because they know all kind of people are coming there looking for healing. We have always shared our cultural forms, and those cultural forms then extend into, well, is only the Pandit Kajari my child? Or is only the Babalao could give my child a bush bath? Those are the ways that we share things underneath that historians don't see or document, that we deny, and then we come with this narrative now which says that Indians and Africans are suspicious of each other. If you look at how stick fight, for example, has evolved, there were two forms of stick fight that came to Trinidad. One of them was Gatka, and it was a Sikh form of one-handed stick fighting. You have stick fight and whip-wielding arts that are shared experiences from all over. And the reason why we don't have Gatka so popular anymore is because the Gatka and the Kalinda people used to war. And then the Gatka fellas and them realized, well, wait, no, this one-handed thing not really working. So I had to learn the two-handed thing, which is why so many of the older stick fighters were Indian, because they found a way to share. The jab, which is the whip-wielding jab, has lots of African elements. And then when you start to hear these stick fight songs, they have a lot of Bhojpuri words in them, not French Creole words. They have Bhojpuri words in them. So this idea that we were suspicious and not getting along, it's foolishness. And the cultural forms, if we go in and we look at them and we investigate them and take away that veneer of political separation that exists, we can go and find the answers that we need.
Who's the we, though? Turning it back there.
Me? I always count myself in there. I want to big up Maria Nunes, who has been doing amazing work looking at these forms. And you know, there's an interesting thing happening. I would say, like, in the last 10 years or so, everybody's talking about, oh, carnival is dying, and you know, this and that and the next, and you know, the bikini and beads, it's too much. Yeah, well, I mean, that's an economic model that's successful, but how is it real and connected to anything? It's not connected to nothing. It's connected to nothing. But what was happening was that the people who were doing the photography on the streets, so like, say, the camera, the newspaper camera people, I think that they were focusing on the light-skinned girls who were playing Mass and Hearts and things. That's what you used to see in the magazines that were produced. Then all of a sudden, you have the internet coming along, and people like Maria Nunes and Mark Lindesay and others have been photographing exclusively traditional Mass. Then all of a sudden people saying, oh, look at how plenty traditional Mass. It was because it was not being focused on. It was not being, nobody was turning a lens to it, nobody was showing any interest in it. Now all of a sudden you're seeing plenty traditional Mass. Like if it had gone anywhere, it's been there. But we need to find ways to make sure that it survives and it goes beyond the communities where, you know, you have a few families who are holding on for dear life to these traditions. So how are our institutions then going to how are we creating ways for these families who are small families who are trying to sustain these traditions? I know, like, for example, Ronald Alfred. If anybody here wants to, on a Sunday, go down to Whipmasters Avenue in Couva and learn whip wheeling and stick fight tradition, you can go down there. Give them a little contribution because they are the ones who are keeping our arts alive. And they're not only keeping the arts alive, they're finding ways with the Bois Academy to have conversations about so many things like restorative justice, like masculinity, like order, like setting up friendly societies because they don't have resources from the mainstream sources. So they're finding ways to create resources, do the research, get things published, because that's what they have to do. And they're doing it in ways that we are not seeing and we are not celebrating.
I want to reach back out to the audience one last time, but you were trying to say something, Mariano?
No, well, just to make the point that traditional communities, for a long time, we've known that get along with one another in ways that are not well documented, and that there are no real Indian communities per se. There are areas in which there are more Indians than there are anybody else. But you cannot get away from the racial divide, and look how quickly we buy into the narrative of a 1%. And we identify with a race and a class. So that I want to say, for all of that sense of belonging, and by the way, they couldn't have any more integrated community than Woodbrook, which is where literally the Syrian community grew up with almost everybody else. Right? But at the same token, and Rio Claro, and or Arima, from that matter, right? But at the same token, there are habits of beings into which we, how shall we call it? We retreat very quickly, and it basically takes over our language. So for all of those examples that you've given for community living, I'm saying that there are obvious examples in which the society fractures quickly.
What is
But I just used it for you. The 1%, the concept of the 1%, how quickly we are buying to. But I can. But because the concept of a 1% has come in popular language to mean one particular race, which is not true.
So let's take maybe one or two more hands.
Hi, good morning. Ria Mohammed Pollard. Just a comment.
And this gentleman here next.
Okay. I'm with the Equal Opportunity Commission. I would like to build on Springer, Ms. Springer and Senator Chote. Not just the existence of the Equal Opportunity Commission, but I'd just like to point out a little history quickly for you. The Act of Equal Opportunity Act was really in 2000. And only until 2008, the commission came into, I should say, commissioners were appointed by His Excellency. The real question is, why did it take 8 years for the Equal Opportunity Commission to actually come into force? And I'm going to give you a little quick history and build on you the individual responsibility and the purpose of advocacy. It was a blind man, Kenneth Surratt, who would have basically brought a constitutional motion against the state for basically not just having the piece of legislation enacted, but to bring it into the commission into existence. Because in 2000, while this piece of legislation was enacted, only in 2008, by this blind man, Kenneth Surratt, bringing a constitutional motion, and even at the trial stage, the actual act was deemed unconstitutional because it excluded sexual orientation. Of course, he would have taken it to the privy, and here we are today, Equal Opportunity Commission. But 10 years later, still no sexual orientation under the Equal Opportunity Act. So, again, our responsibility as individuals for advocacy, and more so that I'm representing the Equal Opportunity Commission, we do active public education exercise. And yes, you can come to us, you can go on our website, but we also facilitate a lot of free workshops for organizations, both private and public, and we have a continued job to promulgate information, what state provides free of charge. That's my contribution.
Thank you. And one last comment in front of the gentleman in the blue shirt here.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've enjoyed this conversation, and we're talking about an equal place, and I just wondered about the fact that between 1887 and 1899, the island of Tobago was annexed to Trinidad. And the nature of that annexation was such that by 1899, the reality was that Tobago was made a ward of Trinidad, and that the existing laws of Trinidad were made the existing laws of Tobago and imposed on them. And I just wondered whether the panel had any thoughts on the inequality with regard to the way in which Tobago has been absorbed into Trinidad and Tobago, and in the context of discussing an equal place. Thank you.
And so if folks want to respond to the last two interventions, and also offer closing comments in a round.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is one of the traditional sort of fault lines, as it were, of divisions. I mean, you could quarter Trinidad and Tobago into so many lines and so many fractures. And coming back to, I think Mariano mentioned it, Lloyd Best saying, I think the first time he talked, it was in 1976 or 78, that everybody in Trinidad feels like a second-class citizens because there are so many fractures and so many lines, north, south, in the Petro-Trin matter, country and town, in the water issue now, Trinidad and Tobago, Indians and Africans, 1% and the rest, etc. So those fractures are the way in which the society has been sort of quartered. And a lot of that comes from colonial inheritances, and a lot of it comes from our own feelings post-independence to sort of handle our business in the way with a certain level of, sort of progressive thought and a level of imagination. And my closing thing would be to sort of address Mariano with respect to that 1% thing. The concept of a 1% is not only words, and it's not only a literal description of something or somebody. And I think to sort of a deeper reflection will take us into asking a question of why that term has found traction in the society and why it found traction so quickly and so easily. And if it has found traction as it has, what is that expressing through that? Through that expression of what is it expressing? So rather than the sort of knee-jerk defensiveness about, oh, this 1% of people look one way, etc., what is the interaction of that language with people? Because we are a people who are friendly with language and who divest and reinvest words and language on a regular basis, on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. So what, therefore, is being expressed with that, and what in the society is it sort of tapping into and resonating with that is finding root, rather than simply saying, well, it's a foolish thing and let's just sort of dismiss it. There is need for much greater, and I want to add the word respectful, much more respectful observation and consideration of what is happening in the society.
So I think we have time for a very quick round of comments from the other panelists before we have to close.
I just want to big up Barbara Jenkins, who was my Form 3 geography teacher, who first alerted me to the fact that we were living in a time that we would have to see differently, and that the great struggle of the future generations would be the environment. And, you know, I've spent so many years of my life trying to incorporate and find ways to make people see that, you know, we can't separate ourselves from what is around us. So to the gentleman from Swim Call, I'm totally hearing you, and I totally feel like we need to look at how the things that we're doing to the environment are impacting us emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. And yeah, that's it.
I think the point I want to make is about belonging and ownership. And the reason why I raise those matters about institutions is because they belong to us. And unfortunately, perhaps there's a lot in our psyche, in our past, that basically makes them foreign to us. The very specific example of the garbage dump as this thing from a landfill tells us a lot, because also from the evidence is that the people in the West and Ports of Spain suffer from respiratory issues and asthmatic conditions, and a far greater percentage than those who live to the East. All right? And that's a very classic case in point. But it also has to do with taking responsibility and demanding certain types of performance out of the way our institutions function. And I make the point, again, that the development of a society is really about the strength of its institutions, and how we buy into that. And that's precisely where I raise the point about second-class citizens, because it really says we don't belong, we don't buy it. And that's also reflected in terms of our emigration rates for our graduates. And we have to face, something is telling us when more than 80% of our graduates leave. Thank you.
Oh. Just a few words, Sheila. I think if we dig down far enough, what we'll find is the inequity, the perception of inequity.
The reality of inequity.
Yes. Well, it's not always the reality. Sometimes, regardless of how successful people become, they still think that somebody else is better than them, and for the wrong reasons and so on. So it's a complex issue, as you say. To get to Professor Cudjoe's suggestion, I think we have to appreciate that we can lobby, people's groups can lobby. If one of the things that causes us aggravation in society and causes us real pain is the way in which words are thrown around, particularly in the electronic media, about different races. You know, Indians have all the money, Indians are this, Africans are that, 1%ers are something else. It's the language of hate, and we do not have laws which deal with hate language or, you know, crimes, hate crimes. We have people who are murdering because they think someone's sexual orientation means that he or she ought to be killed. That's a hate crime, and it can have an impact in the way in which law and order operate, or in the way in which we get justice. So I think we should be a little more concerned about lobbying for particular things to change some of the laws which can very easily improve our lot in Trinidad and Tobago.
My job is just to thank Sheila, Attillah, Mariano, and Sofia and all of you for this rich discussion. Let's do it again. Invite us to do it where you are, and let's convert it into action. Thank you all.